It's 5 to 7. He looked to the heavens when he heard the engines hum. A sky full of planes and each one with a bomb. And they're gonna wanna drop them on someone. It's 5 to 7.
Well, good evening and welcome to Islands at War. Keith Only here for this episode for the first time in 14 months or so that Nick and I have been doing this podcast. This is the first time that we have been unable to coordinate our diaries. We both have people over for the weekend when we would have been doing the recording. We've reached June 1942. And it just so happens that in June 1942, my grandfather, William Henry Pengelly, RN, was torpedoed in the Mediterranean, the details of which I'll pass on to you shortly. And indeed, in fact, for this special edition, I thought I would give you an account of my grandfather's career in the Royal Navy. He joined in 1915. We'll go through the detail to when he came out in 1945. I knew him very, very well. I was born in 1958 and indeed lived with him in the house that my grandmother had rented during the German occupation. Whilst Will was away, my grandfather's name. William, we'll refer to him, Will, and my grandmother was Ellen, and when she appears in the story, we'll refer to her as Ellie. So I think you'll find it an interesting account of not one man's war, but one man's participation in a number of wars, as you will see as we progress through this account. So I will be doing later in the year a talk on my grandfather's life, an illustrated talk. And see, these are the original, or rather the initial notes that I've made to support that tour, be an illustrated tour. Of course, being a podcast, you will only be able to see the odd photograph that I tweet on our Twitter site. But anyway, here we go. This is an account of William Henry Pengelly, RN, his story within the Royal Navy. So there is no recorded evidence that there has been any other members of our family that have served in the military before him, or indeed since. Will's father, my great-grandfather, was an illiterate house painter, and the family lived in St. Peter Port on Guernsey in a good deal of poverty. When he was a child, Will's mother left the family, which now included two younger sisters. Will was born in 1898, I should add. So he had two younger sisters, and his mother formed a relationship with an English soldier who was stationed on the island. She went on to eventually marry this man and have a second family. But Will left school and was apprenticed to a local stationer and printer, only yards from the family home. And it's indeed, many years later, it's how, when he came to marry my grandmother, he mentioned that he'd first spotted her at the same location and fell in love with her. But that's a story, as they say, for another day. But when Will was 16, World War I had commenced, and he was determined to escape both the poverty and fractured family life he was sharing with his father and sisters and the job he loathed. So he knew that by joining the military, he could leave the island and form a new life and to a large degree find some adventure. Due to his mother leaving the family, Will had an abiding dislike of the army, so he elected to join the Royal Navy. Therefore, on August 26th, 1915, he signed up as a naval rating designated as Boy 2. He was 16 years and 11 months old. His first posting was HMS Impregnable 3, an obsolete ironclad warrior-class warship, originally named HMS Black Prince, which was used as a training ship, and it was based in Plymouth. Will's Navy career had begun, and on March the 9th, 1916, Will was promoted to Boy 1 and the next day was transferred to HMS Vivid I, which was the Royal Navy's seamanship, signalling and telegraphy school based in Devonport. His time there was short, and on the 8th of April 1916 he was transferred to HMS Prince of Wales, which was a formidable class pre-dreadnought battleship launched originally in March 1902. Will was part of the ship's company when the Prince of Wales was posted to the Mediterranean in order to support Allied forces in the Dardanelles campaign, but she remained there only briefly before being ordered to the Adriatic to reinforce Italian forces there in case of an attack by the Austro-Hungarian Navy. During his time aboard the Prince of Wales in September 1916, Will was accordingly promoted to ordinary seaman. The Prince of Wales was then ordered home in early 1917 and reduced to reserve upon her arrival. Will was then posted to HMS Victory I, which was a shore base situated at Portsmouth, and he was there from April 1917 until June 1917. And in June 1917, Will was then posted to HMS Pengelley, an Arabis-class sloop, which was the largest of the 5 subclasses of minesweeping sloops, which are part of the Flower-class shipbuilding project. On joining Pengelley, Will again was promoted, this time to able seaman, and remained with Pengelley while she was assigned to the 10th Cruiser Squadron, which formed the Northern Patrol, which had the crucial task of denying enemy trade the use of the seas above Great Britain. The Northern Patrol was part of the British distant blockade of Germany, which took place from 1914 to 1919. Its main task was to prevent trade to and from Germany by checking merchant ships and their cargoes. It was also to stop German warships, raiders and other German naval ships from leaving the North Sea for the Atlantic Ocean or entering the North Sea from the Atlantic, and also to protect Shetland against German invasion and to gather intelligence from intercepted neutral ships. Now, the seas between Scotland and Norway were notoriously dangerous. In the summer, mist and sudden high winds were common. For the rest of the year, there were gales, stormy seas, long nights with short, dull days under leaden skies, and it was common for winds to reach force 9 or 10, raising seas higher than ship's masts. And a local phenomenon known as lumps were waves which had amalgamated and which, in force 10 gale, arrived without warning, damaging ships and occasionally sinking them. So Will saw out World War I on Pengelley, and in April 1919 was transferred to HMS Daphne, which was an Arcacia-class sloop, not too dissimilar to Pengelley. But in fact, his time aboard Daphne was only a matter of weeks, and he was transferred to HMS Myrtle, a sloop of the same class. Now, this transfer almost cost Will his life, as Myrtle was part of the deployment known as Operation Red Trek. Operation Red Trek was the name given to the British campaign in the Baltic in 1918 to 1919. In fact, I think it was more closer to 1918 to 1920, which was part of the Allied intervention in the Russian Civil War. The intervention played a key role in enabling the establishment of the independent states of Estonia and Latvia, but failed overall in its objective to secure the control of Petrograd, now Leningrad, by Russian White forces, one of the main goals of the campaign. The Russian Baltic Fleet was the key naval force available to the Bolsheviks and essential to the protection of Leningrad. The fleet was severely depleted after the First War and Russian Revolution, but still formed a significant force. Many of the officer corps, who were on the White Russian side in the Civil War, or had been murdered, but some competent leaders remained. And on the 26th of June, 1919, the first fleet sweeping flotilla of the Royal Navy arrived at Bjorko, Finland, to reinforce the British forces in the Baltic. On the 16th of July, 4 sloops of the first flotilla, Myrtle, Gentian, Lilac and Lupin, were employed sweeping mines east of Saaremaa in Estonia. The sloops worked in pairs, and Myrtle, with Will aboard, was working with the sloop Gentian. During the afternoon, Myrtle and Gentian were attempting to sink mines that had been brought to the surface by Lilac and Lupin, who had swept prior to Myrtle and Gentian becoming involved, and then Gentian struck an unswept mine. Myrtle went to Gentian's assistance, but also struck a mine, which broke off the forepart of the ship and killed 6 men. Myrtle sank 90 minutes after striking a mine. Myrtle's commanding officer, Lieutenant Commander Richard Scott, was awarded the Bronze Albert Medal for life-saving for his actions during the sinking, returning alone to the ship to search for a missing man. Now, Will was the only man from the engine room to survive, and I remember him saying that he was in the water for some time and was lucky, that it happened to be in July. It was in the Gulf of Finland, you'll remember. The 6 men to perish are in fact included on a commemorative plaque at Portsmouth Cathedral, with similar memorials in Tallinn, Estonia, and Riga, Latvia. A significant unrest took place among British sailors in the Baltic. This included small-scale mutinies amongst the crews of HMS Vindictive, HMS Delhi, plus other ships stationed in Bjorko Sound. The causes were a general war weariness. Many of the crews had fought in World War I, poor food and accommodation, and also a lack of leave, and the effects of Bolshevik propaganda. Operation Red Trek is well worth investigating and researching, and I recommend the following book: Churchill's Secret War with Lenin, British and Commonwealth Military Intervention in the Russian Civil War, 1918-20, written by one Damien Wright. However, back to Will. On his return to the UK later in July 1919, Will was posted to HMS Pembroke, a training base in Chatham, then back to HMS Victory Shore Base. For a short time, he then served aboard HMS Maidstone, a submarine depot ship, and was based at Rosyth. Will then saw out the whole of 1920 at HMS Victory, and then in January 1921, he transferred to HMS Witherington, W-class destroyer, which was part of the home fleet. Will remained with Witherington until May 1922. Will was then posted to HMS Excellent so that he could attend gunnery training courses, and he then returned to Victory 1 whilst awaiting a further posting. In February 1924, Will joined HMS Hermes, an aircraft carrier that was commissioned in February 1924, so she was box fresh when Will joined her. Hermes was the first ship to be designed as an aircraft carrier, although Japan's Hosho was first to be launched and commissioned, and Will remained with Hermes until June 1925, seeing service in the Mediterranean. Now, for the next 6 years, Will served at various shore bases before finally going back to sea in February 1931 aboard HMS Cornwall. And Will was with Cornwall until December 1933, in which time Cornwall was assigned to China Station. Now, the China Station, which had originally been established in 1865, had as its area of responsibility along the coasts of China and its navigatable rivers, the western part of the Pacific Ocean, and the waters around the Dutch East Indies. And the Royal Navy supported and cooperated with British commercial interests in this area. The formation had bases at at Singapore, at HMS Tamar, in Hong Kong, and Weihai in the Chinese province of Shandong. Will was based in Hong Kong, and I have photographs of his time there, which was often ashore. Pictures show him at rifle training and living in tented encampments on shore, obviously. So he was away in China from February 1931 and December 1933. My father was born 9 months later. Go figure. So Will was then stationed at shore bases in the UK until April 1935, at which point he was transferred to HMS Exmouth, an E-class destroyer. Exmouth was deployed in the Med, and during his time, but also in August 1936, nominated for non-intervention patrol duties during the outbreak of the Spanish Civil War. Exmouth's role was being deployed in patrolling the Spanish coast in order to prevent illegal transfer of goods to merchant shipping and for protection of British shipping in the area. Will was aboard, in fact, when leaders and members of the Basque Nationalist Party were taken into exile to escape prosecution from Franco's fascist troops. And I remember, as a child, Will had a small pair of what I thought were clogs, and it was at a time when the awful song Tulips from Amsterdam was popular, and it contained the line Little Mice with Clogs on. And I thought the clogs were from Holland. Will explained that they were ornamental sabots, and he had picked them up as a souvenir when in Barcelona. And he also said that they came under air attack when in Barcelona harbour. Will kept by fascist forces, of course, probably Italian fighter pilots in Spanish aircraft. Will was aboard Exmouth until they returned to the UK, and he then spent a further week at Victory until he joined HMS Erebus, which was a monitor. Now, monitors were designed as stable gun platforms with a shallow draft to allow operations close inshore in support of land operations, and were not intended to contest naval batteries. Erebus was equipped with two 15-inch 42 guns and a single forward turret mounted on a tall enclosure in order to extend the range of fire to over 40,000 yards. This is over 22 miles. And in fact, Erebus was later used for coastal bombardment during the Normandy landings on the 6th of June 1944, firing at the batteries at Barfleur and Le Pernelle. Will was with Erebus until he was pensioned off on the 26th of September 1938, which was in fact his 40th birthday. So Will returned home to Guernsey, to my grandmother, and lived at Le Villers area of the Forest Parish. He found employment at the initial construction work at the new reservoir and the parish of St Saviour's. However, the winds of war were gathering, and he was eventually called back to the Royal Naval Reserve on the 31st of July 1939, less than 40 days before World War II enveloped Britain and her colonies. By the 21st of August 1939, he had joined Roscommon, a training base in Portland, before being posted to HMS Kimberley on the 16th of December 1939. Kimberley was still being fitted out, having been launched in June 1939. She then completed acceptance trials and was deployed in the northwest approaches in order to intercept enemy shipping. On the 21st of February 1940, Kimberley intercepted and captured the German freighter Wahihi, providing a boarding party to take the ship back to Kirkwall, Orkney, as a prize of war. And Easter 1940 happened to fall at the end of March, and I have in my possession, in the family archives, an Easter card that Will sent to my grandmother Ellie, which had a picture of Kimberley within. The card was the last direct contact between them until May 1945, due, of course, to the Germans arriving on Guernsey in June 1940, and, as we all know, the occupation of the Channel Islands commenced. However, back with Will, after the commencement of the First Battle of Narvik in Norway, following the British landings, part of Operation Wilfred, following the German invasion, on the 8th of March, Kimberley deployed with destroyers Bedouin, Eskimo and Punjabi in order to assist HMS Glowworm, which was under attack by the German battleship Hipper. After deploying to Bodo in the north, Kimberley returned to Narvik on the 13th of April and took part in what became the Second Battle of Narvik, during which time Kimberley attempted to tow destroyer HMS Cossack, which had been damaged in action with German destroyers and disabled. The attempt was unsuccessful. When discussing his Narvik experiences with my uncle in the 60s, Will referred to volunteering to go ashore with a raiding party to disable a German seaplane in Narvik harbour. Now, I remember this conversation taking place nearly 60 years ago, and Will spoke of a firefight with German troops that were also attempting to reach the plane. During the exchange of fire, he lost a pal who received a wound to the head, and I recall that his shipmate was called simply Ginger. I'm still researching this memory, but have been in touch with a Dutch writer named Peter de Jong. Peter wrote a book about the seaplane type, which was a Dornier Do-24. And Peter referred me to an account of Hitler's invasion of Narvik and the Luftwaffe's involvement. The account contains the following account of the actual Dornier involved and the part played by the German pilot Adolf Lodock. Do forgive my pronunciation. Lodock's account confirms that his plane was in Narvik on the 13th of April when Pengelley was present. Lodock had come under fire whilst in the plane from HMS Warspite and suffered some damage. I'll give you the following account from de Jong's account. The flying boat itself survived the onslaught with minor damage caused by machine gun fire when a British party in a motorboat attempted to tow it away. Having patched up the bullet holes, Lodock's crew departed Narvik at 3:28 hours on the 16th of April, carrying 2 wounded naval officers and a British prisoner of war who was somehow thought to be a nephew of Winston Churchill. This article can be found at a certain web address, which I will tweet after this program has gone out. Okay, now if anybody is interested in the Narvik campaign, then I recommend the following books. Narvik by Donald McIntyre, Death at Dawn, Captain Warburton Lee VC and the Battle of Narvik by Alf R. Jacobson, The Doomed Expedition by Jack Adams, Carrier Glorious by J. Winton, and Engage the Enemy More Closely by C. Barnett. Following participation at Narvik, HMS Pengelley returned to Scapa Flow to wait reassignment. She was then nominated for transfer to the Med and prepared for foreign service, with damage sustained in Norway being repaired, and on the 16th of May 1940 she took passage for Egypt, arriving at Alexandria on the Egyptian Mediterranean coast on the 23rd of May. In June 1940, Pengelley deployed for convoy defence in the Red Sea, and in August she assisted in the evacuation of over 7,000 British nationals from Berbera in the British Somaliland. During the remaining months of 1940, Pengelley was engaged in duties in and around the Red Sea, including, in October, an engagement with Italian destroyers. And on the 21st of October, she was engaged by the Italian Sauro-class destroyer Francisco Nullo, and during the exchange was driven ashore on Hami Island off the coast of Egypt in the Red Sea. Now, Pengelley managed to fire a torpedo at the Francisco Nullo while coming under fire from Italian shore batteries. The Francisco Nullo herself was damaged by fire from Pengelley and herself beached. The next day, Nullo was destroyed by 3 Bristol Blenheim bombers. Pengelley sustained damage to her engine room, which disabled her, and she was taken in tow for passage to Port Sudan by HMS Leander. So Will survived to live yet another day. Pengelley was patched up and resumed area convoy duties, but at a reduced speed. In January 1941, Pengelley made passage to Bombay in order to complete repairs, and by March, Pengelley and Will were back in Alexandria for deployment with the Mediterranean Fleet. Will now made a decision that certainly saved his life again. His time on Pengelley was at an end, and on the 6th of May, probably because of his age, he was 43 by then, he was offered the chance of joining HMS Hood. The Hood, of course, was to be sunk by the Bismarck during the Battle of the Denmark Strait, just weeks later, on the 24th of May 1941. Will had always preferred to serve on smaller vessels. Also, in order to join the Hood, he would have had to have left the Med and travelled back to the UK. So although his sisters now lived in the UK, both had been bombed out, and he obviously could not return to Guernsey. Thus he stayed in Alexandria and joined HMS Medway on the 6th of May 1941. Now the Medway was a submarine depot vessel. You remember during the earlier part of this account, he had already served on such a vessel. Now, a depot ship was a floating workshop, accommodation and rest area, and also a supply vessel. Medway was the first large submarine depot ship to be specifically designed and built for the Royal Navy, and Medway arrived in Alexandria initially in May 1940 and was deployed in support of submarine operations in the Eastern Med, and this deployment continued until 1942 when Will joined her complement. Will always told a story whereby when he first went aboard Medway, he noticed that the portholes immediately above the waterline were open. He asked a petty officer if they were to remain open when they went to sea. The answer was yes, because the heat was making conditions difficult below decks. Will, being an old sweat, advised that they be closed once at sea because if the ship were to be torpedoed, it would sink like a stone, given the fact that they were to be loaded with torpedoes for delivery to Haifa and 1,135 personnel for transfer to a new base at Beirut. I think this would have been the time when there was the so-called flap in Alexandria and personnel were being transferred out of harm's way, to Beirut being now part of what we know as Lebanon. So at this stage it should also be mentioned that Will had a lifelong interest in canaries, and I recall that he had an impressive aviary during the 1960s and 70s and bred and showed to a high level, winning many prizes. It was odd then that given the conditions aboard, Will bought a canary in a small cage whilst ashore in Alexandria. Now the ship's company got out and about quite a lot whilst in Egypt, and I found on the internet a photograph of some ratings on camels and mules with the Pyramid of Giza behind them. And there he is. One can actually pick out Will. The canary goes on to feature again shortly. So on the morning of the 29th of June, Medway left Alexandria in a convoy escorted by the cruiser HMS Dido and 7 fleet destroyers. Apparently, Will continued to raise the issue of the open portholes so much he was taken to see Captain Philip Rock Keane. As Will told the story, Rock Keane dismissed him rather brusquely and the portholes remained open. Next day, the 30th of June, at 8:24 hours, Medway was struck by torpedoes fired by U-372. A contemporary report stated that the mother hen sank quite quickly, stern first. Some 1,105 passengers and crew were rescued. 30 men lost their lives. And I actually have a photograph of the ship bottom up with people sat on the hull, Will being one of them. Given the photograph, I am sceptical that the ship sank as quickly as complained, but Will eventually slid down the hull into the water, and in doing so badly cut his back open on barnacles and forever remained scarred as a result. Will recalled that when the torpedo struck, he rushed below to assist in getting people off the ship and also to rescue his canary. Now, where the bird was supposed to fly to, God knows, but I suppose at least it had a chance. And one of the 30 men that died was known to Will, and he got trapped and went down with the ship. Will said then, when he was picked up, Rock Keane had already been picked up, and he was not happy with the personnel picked up after him, as he said he should have been the last man off the ship, being the captain, of course. Rock Keane was obviously distressed and apparently spoken to by the captain of the vessel that picked them up, and I am still researching this incident in the aftermath of the sinking. I do beg your pardon. Now, Medway had been carrying 90 torpedoes for delivery to Haifa, and 47, following the sinking, bobbed up to the surface and were recovered. Loss of Medway and the equipment she carried was a huge blow, and Allied submarine operations in the Eastern Med temporarily came to a standstill. Now, Will lost all his possessions, including all his service medals up to that point, and he was able to secure replacements in the early 1970s. I recall the process. Now, the survivors of the Medway were taken to Beirut, and the small depot ship HMS Talbot moved from Malta to replace her, and Talbot eventually changed her name to Medway too. Now, this follows an epilogue, really, of those events. you recall, the U-boat that sunk Medway was the U-372, which was a German-type VIIC submarine. Now, she was herself sunk on the 4th of August, 1942, southwest of Haifa. And she was captained by one Heinz Joachim Neumann. She was sunk by depth charges from the British destroyers HMS Sikh and HMS Zulu, and also by additional depth charges dropped from a Wellington bomber from 221 Squadron. Now, all 47 aboard the U-boat survived, including, curiously, a Lebanese civilian whose presence on board has never been explained and may have been a German agent for German intelligence. Will served upon Medway too in December 1943. His character and efficiency assessments were as followed. Character, very good. Efficiency, satisfactory. And of course, they were signed off by Philip Rockkeane. Will saw out the duration based at Ardrossan, Scotland, with the rank of Sergeant of the Guard. He returned home on leave in June 1945 and was eventually demobbed in September 1945. 30 years since he had signed up as a 16-year-old. Quite a time in the Royal Navy. And indeed, I have in my possession many, many letters and papers, including a letter. Well, first of all, I should explain my uncle who married into the family, who's still alive, and he's in his 90s. He would ask Will on numerous occasions to talk about his naval career. My uncle himself had suffered as a teenager from TB and had to spend some time in a sanatorium, so he was ruled out of joining the services, and it's an irony and blessing that he's reached his 90s. But he would often ask Will to talk about his time in the Royal Navy, and I was extremely lucky to be able to listen into those conversations. And being a young shaver, it made a huge impression upon me. I was very proud of my grandfather and spent a lot of time with him. The internet, of course, has enabled me to research much of this. The research still goes on. And one of the things that my uncle told me about was that Will had sought to return to the Royal Navy when the Korean War commenced. And I have a letter now within the family archive of Will's GP firmly telling him that he was unfit for future service. Will was at that time 54. He was very proud to have served in the Royal Navy. When he came home in 1945, he was so proud that his wife had managed to see out the dark days of the occupation. And he himself was, as is evident in these letters, never lost sight of the fact that my grandmother, Ellie, herself had had a terrible war in and during the occupation. Will's father died of malnutrition in March 1944, and his father-in-law also died of malnutrition, starvation in December 1944. We have many other tales of the occupation, but these are for another day, and this was primarily an account of Will's sterling service for the nation, culminating in that torpedo attack on Medway in June 1942, which has prompted me to get the notes out. And as I say, if you're in Guernsey later in the year, I shall be putting on a talk, illustrated talk about Will's time. I'm a very, very proud grandson, proud to have known him, and all I can say is what a fantastic life. And he is buried in the parochial cemetery in St Martin's Parish here on Guernsey, and he is known as, on his gravestone, as Sailor Pengelley. I do hope that you have enjoyed this account of one man's service. If you wish to know any more details about Will and his time, and the research continues, then you can email me at occupied@gnetradio.com. And as I say, I hope you've enjoyed hearing this account in this special, and Nick and I will resume service shortly But I thought what we would also do in this special is as a tribute to William Henry Pengelly, Royal Navy. Thank you for listening.
And he looked to the heavens when he heard the engines hum. A sky full of planes and each one with a bomb. And they're gonna wanna drop them on someone. It's 5 to 7. All his friends and family had gone. Left on a ship 'cause they knew